From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We're going to start, as usual, with the check on the markets. Joining us now is Scarlett Fuso. Scarlett, I don't see a lot of direction in equities, but help me.
Yeah, it's a mixed day overall, but the theme here is that tech is really hogging the spotlight. You've got a big M&A deal in the chip sector, while the first big tech name reports results after the close. So Advanced Micro Devices buying Xilinx for $35 billion. This is an all-stock deal that values Xilinx at a 25% premium to its last close. Xilinx is the best performer in the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index. AMD is the worst. And you're looking at Microsoft higher before its fourth quarter, or I should say, fiscal first quarter numbers due out after the close. Cloud computing will be a big winner. Obviously, a lot of optimism embedded in the stock. It's up 35% this year, outperforming the rest of the tech sector and the broader market. And the NASDAQ 100 today is the winner of the major indexes. In fact, it's outperforming the S&P by the most in 2 weeks. I mentioned Microsoft reporting later today. You've got four big names on Thursday: Amazon, Apple, Alphabet, and Facebook. Not surprisingly that we're getting this outperformance because tech is the sector most likely to see its earnings hold up. In the second quarter, tech and only healthcare were the only two sectors that posted profit and sales growth. Of course, all of that is priced in, which is why value stocks have actually outperformed in October for a second straight month. Gina Martin-Adams over at Bloomberg Intelligence says that growth companies are beating estimates more widely than value companies, but analysts are upgrading their fourth quarter forecasts more for these value companies than for growth. And when value stocks do beat estimates, they outperform the S&P 500, whereas growth stocks do not. And we've seen that play out over the last couple of weeks.
So, Scarlett, bring back to Washington for a moment. We've been talking about the stimulus on again, off again. Now it's pretty clearly off, at least until after the election, maybe after that. Are the markets reacting to that at all at this point?
I mean, we still see it in equities because you're not getting much traction in the moves in equities overall, and we're a little changed. And you also see it in safe havens like the U.S. Treasury market. The 10-year yield is down for a third day. It's back below 80 basis points, also below its 200-day moving average. It was kind of trying to get past that, but we are not getting that breakout for now. David?
Thank you so very much, Scarlett Fu, for that report on the markets. I want to talk about that election. It is just a week away now, with the candidates crisscrossing the country to get their messages out and their voters out to the polls. Welcome now a veteran of those campaigns. Lanhee Chen was policy director for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. He is now a fellow at the Hoover Institution and director of domestic policy studies at Stanford. So, Lanhee, always a pleasure to have you with us. But give us a sense, because you've been in one of these presidential campaigns in that last week. What are these two campaigns focused on right now?
Well, David, this last week is really about all hands on deck. This is really the opportunity that both campaigns have to mobilize their base of support, as well as to make sure that they are conveying whatever their closing message is. And it's pretty clear the Trump campaign has their closing message. They're attacking Joe Biden as a career politician who's never gotten anything done. And the Biden folks are coming right back at the Trump campaign, assailing the president for his handling of COVID and then the economic downturn afterwards. So both campaigns really are out there with a singular message, ideally, as well as reaching out to those voters who they know will support their candidate and making sure that they get out and actually vote. That is a very important thing as we go into the close here.
So, Lanhee, 2020 is different from any other year in so many different ways, between a pandemic and what's happening in the economy. So many things have gone on. Typically, when you have an incumbent, as we do now in President Trump, it's a referendum on the incumbent and the incumbent's record. Are we talking about that at all at this point? I mean, we've thought that President Trump would be running on the economy.
Yeah. Well, certainly the Biden campaign, they want it to be a referendum on Trump's handling of COVID. That is very clear from their campaign messaging, from what you saw from Vice President Biden in the debate last week, from everything that they're telling the American people through their campaign advertising, digital, TV, et cetera. They want this to be a referendum on Trump and how Trump has done. The president, for his part, would like to talk forward-looking about the economy, what his plans are, how he plans to recover from COVID. In that sense, it is a fairly typical incumbent reelection campaign, in the sense that you've got one side really trying to make it a referendum, and clearly the Biden team believes that they are at a point of strength when they are talking about the Trump record, particularly, as I noted, on COVID.
So Lanhee, as we go into this election, there are so many things that are in question. The polls seem to indicate fairly stubbornly, if I can say that the former vice president has a lead, not just nationally, but even in some battleground states, although it's narrower than the national number. But I've also seen some reports, like Pew has got a report out, that the percentage of Trump voters who are really enthusiastic is higher than the percentage of Biden voters. Biden seems to be gaining, but is there an enthusiasm gap here between these two candidates?
Well, I think that, David, is the biggest source of concern for the Biden campaign, which is, at the end of the day, we talked about mobilization. Mobilization is driven by enthusiasm. And at this point, it does seem like the enthusiasm for Trump affirmatively from his supporters is greater than the affirmative enthusiasm from Biden. The thing we don't know is how strong the motivation is to vote against Trump. You hear this often, Biden supporters, that, look, I may not be that excited about Joe Biden, but I'm certainly excited about voting against Donald Trump. And so this year it's going to be interesting. We're going to look at the intensity of support for Trump and in some ways the intensity of opposition to Trump to help gauge how successful Biden's going to be. It's not a traditional situation where you look at intensity of support for both candidates, because it's pretty clear on that measure, Vice President Biden is not doing as well as President Trump is.
Lanhee, jump forward, if you can, to January and play out the alternative scenarios of a second term of President Trump versus a first term of President Biden, specifically on policy. That is what you did for Governor Romney when he ran for president. And I mean not just what the differences are in the policy, but what can get done. What do you think the biggest point of differences in what actually might get done?
Well, I think the biggest question is going to be what happens with control of the Congress, and in particular control of the Senate. I think it's quite clear that the Democrats will hold on to the House. I think the big question is, can Republicans hold the Senate? If Republicans hold the Senate, then it's going to make a big difference in terms of what Vice President Biden can do. But also, frankly, he's going to be constrained, right? He can't go as far to the left as some of his progressive base might want him to go. In some ways, I've argued that might actually be good for Biden. It might actually be good to have the Republican Senate as a foil to say, look, we can't get rid of the filibuster. We can't pack the Supreme Court. We can't go to single-payer health care. We can't do some of the things the progressive left wants to do. So in that sense, for Biden, there is potentially an advantage in having a Republican Senate. Now, for Trump, really, I think if Trump wins, he is going to have a Republican Senate because his coattails are going to carry across some of those senators who are more vulnerable. And then I think it's going to be more business as usual, with one possible exception, which is I do think the president is going to be looking at legacy. And that is something that could be a very powerful motivator for him to work with Democrats. I think we could see a much larger stimulus or recovery package, for example, straight out of the gate. Action maybe on prescription drug pricing and surprise medical billing. There are certain areas where I do see the president maybe trying to work together with Democrats if he's reelected, and even if he's got a majority in the Senate.
And finally, Lanhee, what about infrastructure? Is that possibly a place in which these two candidates actually converge rather than diverge? Or is this really a chimera? Is this really sort of that silver chalice that we can never quite find?
Well, right. I mean, I think it's one of those policy areas where you would expect there to be more agreement. You would have expected something to have gotten done already. I put this into the category of if Trump gets reelected and he's looking to get something done where there is potentially bipartisan support, this could be an area he goes to. In the same way for Vice President Biden, if he gets elected and he's looking to work with the Republican Senate, this is an area potentially where you might find agreement. So I think a lot of this does come down, David. I've been emphasizing to the constituencies I've spoken to, yes, we love to pay attention to the presidential election. Really look at the Senate. Mm-hmm. That is where the rubber's going to hit the road in terms of policy making and what the bounds of the possible and impossible look like.
Lanhee, always great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. That's Lanhee Chen of the Hoover Institution. Programming note, we will have live coverage of election night. That's going to start at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Coming up here, we continue our swing state look at Wisconsin with Republican Congressman Bryan Steil. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. This week, we're taking a closer look at Wisconsin as part of our Swing State series. And today, we welcome Republican Congressman from Wisconsin, Bryan Steil, from the southeast of the state. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. We're taking a look at Wisconsin, what we can expect on election night. Give us your take right now on where this state is. I understand there's something of a bifurcation of rural versus urban and suburban.
There's a jump ball going on right now in Wisconsin, and I think it's going to come down to election night and who turns out the most voters. What we're seeing here on the home stretch is the Republican base is incredibly energized. People are ready to get out and vote. About 50% of all people have probably already voted in the state of Wisconsin. We're approaching that level of turnout. With 7 days to go, it's going to be a matter of making sure we get every vote across the line and the few undecideds to be reaching out to them and having this conversation about how we're going to keep America healthy, how we're going to get Wisconsin back to work, and how we're going to keep our communities safe here in Wisconsin.
Talk about your district in particular, sort of south of Milwaukee, as I understand it, perhaps a lot of suburbs after Milwaukee. Well, give us your sense of where your district is.
The first congressional district is really a cross-section of the state of Wisconsin. It has three blue-collar, family-centered towns of Janesville, Racine, and Kenosha. It picks up some rural areas in between in Walworth County, and then does pick up the southern suburbs of Milwaukee, like Franklin, Oak Creek, Hales Corners, Greendale. And so you have a real mix in southeast Wisconsin.
So I actually have a viewer writing a question here, and it is apropos. We had the Supreme Court just within the last day decide that, in fact, there would not be an extension of the time when you're counting the absentee ballots, as I understand it. How's that going to affect the election, do you think?
I think people in the state of Wisconsin know there's an election on November 3rd, on Tuesday. People have been voting leading up to this election. People have an opportunity to vote on Election Day. I think following the written law here in the state of Wisconsin makes it really crystal clear. There's three ways to vote in Wisconsin. You can vote absentee early. You can vote in person early. That's ongoing all week this week. Or you can vote in person like you would traditionally do on Election Day, November 3rd. I think we're going to see record turnout in the state of Wisconsin. There's three easy ways to do it. And I'm out encouraging everyone to make sure their voice is heard.
Congressman, President Trump obviously carried Wisconsin. It was pivotal, actually, I think it's fair to say, in 2016. Part of what the president, then not president, but now president, said was, we're going to return manufacturing jobs. We're really going to bring them back. Has he delivered on that promise? And particularly in your district, you have some background, I know, working as an executive in some manufacturing companies.
Yeah, I spent a decade working in manufacturing before I ran for office 2 years ago. Before we were punched in the face by coronavirus, we saw jobs coming back to the state of Wisconsin, in particular along the I-94 corridor. That's the Milwaukee airport down to the state line, heading towards Chicago. We've seen numerous companies coming. I attended a groundbreaking of a company moving from Illinois to Wisconsin just the other day, and there was news yesterday. Herringbow, the maker of gummy bears, is breaking ground in Kenosha County in southeast Wisconsin, bringing jobs from international aspects here to Wisconsin. We saw that by putting in place pro-growth policies in Washington, D.C. The work in front of us is going to be to continue to put in place pro-growth policies, trade agreements that are in the benefit of workers and farmers like USMCA, so we continue to see job growth here in the state of Wisconsin so that everyone who wants a job is able to find one.
But has the president delivered on what he promised? I want to go back, maybe it's a sore subject, Foxconn, because there was the big thing with the president flew out. There was going to be a big factory in your district, as I understand it, Foxconn. Did that ever get built?
I visited Foxconn just the other day. Those buildings are going up. Work is getting started. What we're seeing is all along that broader area in Racine and Kenosha County in the southeast corner of the state is significant economic growth. It was slowed down, obviously, by coronavirus currently, but I believe what we will see is jobs continuing to come back as we ultimately defeat this virus. We have cutting red tape. We're getting trade agreements that are positive. We have a competitive tax rate. Those are the kinds of policies in Washington, D.C. we need to grow jobs right here in southeast Wisconsin. We saw a really low unemployment rate environment. We saw the beginning of rising wages. People were quite optimistic before we got hit by coronavirus. I'm optimistic that as we ultimately defeat this virus, we're going to continue to see job growth and wage growth here in the southeast Wisconsin, which is positive. I think that's showing the president's policies delivering for our state.
Congressman, you mentioned Kenosha, and many of us remember the shooting of Jacob Blake, which was really quite an issue for your state in particular, starting in Kenosha. Give us a sense of whether that's playing at all in this election, either on the one side of people who are claiming that we need more racial justice, we really have been unfair to African Americans and other minorities, or on the other, the law and order issue.
I think I just lost the sound feed on there with you. If you can,
can you hear me, Congressman?
I got you. We're chatting about Kenosha. If you look at what's playing out, people and everyone has a right to feel safe. Absolutely everyone. What we saw play out in Kenosha was at the beginning, people's First Amendment rights. That then crossed a line into criminal behavior. And that criminal behavior needs to be stopped. We need to make sure that we hold those who engage in criminal activity accountable. We need to make sure that we're bringing the resources into Kenosha to end the criminal destruction and reestablish public safety. There were 3 bad nights in the community of Kenosha. I was aggressively advocating for additional resources. Our governor did not step up to the plate, but President Trump did come and provide assistance with additional federal resources, such as FBI tactical teams, U.S. Marshals. When you flood the zone with those types of resources, when the president said enough's enough, what we saw was the reestablishment of public safety, and that's positive for everyone in the community of Kenosha. No one wanted to see the buildings that were burned down, the destruction, ultimately the loss of life in the streets of Kenosha. Now we're at a period of time where the community is beginning to heal, to rebuild, and what we need to do is to come together and rebuild the community of Kenosha stronger than ever before.
And looking forward to a week from today, will the issues surrounding the shooting be a factor at all in the election, one way or the other, in your opinion? Or is it more about jobs? Is it more about the economy? And yes, about COVID-19?
I think it's about 3 things. I think it's about how we keep America healthy. I think it's about getting Wisconsin and the nation back to work. But I do think a key piece here is going to be thinking about how do we keep our communities safe. We've seen some of these far left policies calling to defund the police. I believe that makes us less safe. What we need to do is make sure that we have the resources with our men and women in law enforcement to keep our communities more safe. I think that's going to be a critical aspect and on the minds of many people here in the state of Wisconsin. I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. As I drove into this campus town, buildings are still boarded up in the city of Madison. That doesn't make people feel safe. What we need to do is reestablish public safety in our cities so that people can go about their way of life. And I'm standing with the men and women of law enforcement to make sure that they have the resources to be able to do their jobs to keep our communities safe.
And finally, Congressman, to come back to the election, President Trump, as I say, prevailed in Wisconsin last time by a narrow margin, but he prevailed, and it was critically important to him. Many analysts say that was in part because of low voter turnout. There was surprisingly low voter turnout, both for Hillary Clinton and for Donald Trump last time around. As you suggest, there's much higher turnout this time. Does that bode ill for President Trump, do you think, in this election a week from today?
I don't think it is really an indication of which way it's going to go. I think what we're going to see is high voter turnout, and it's going to be a matter of who gets their voters to the polls. And so what I'm spending my time here in the final 7 days in the state of Wisconsin is making sure that conservatives make sure that they get to the polls, whether or not that's in person early or they show up on Election Day. What we're seeing is high engagement, high voter turnout. The volume is at a level 10 in the state of Wisconsin. I think that's a positive thing. I think the more voices that are heard, that's good for our democracy. I ultimately do think the president will win the state of Wisconsin next Tuesday.
The one thing I do have to agree with you, the more people vote, the better for the democracy, however it comes out. That seems exactly right. Thank you so much, Congressman. It was very helpful. That's Congressman Bryan Steil. He's Republican of Wisconsin. And be sure to check out our special on the swing states. That will be airing Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and it'll also be available online. We turn now to Ritika Gupta for Bloomberg First Word News.
Thanks, David. Joe Biden thinks he may have a shot at doing something no Democratic candidate has done in more than 40 years. That is, win the state of Texas. The Democratic presidential nominee told an NBC affiliate in Dallas-Fort Worth the campaign has put out a major effort in Texas. President Trump currently has a 3.2 percentage point lead in the Real Clear Politics average of polls, below the 9-point margin of his own win in 2016. Senators have left the Capitol for a short break, making it virtually impossible for a fiscal stimulus plan to be passed before the election. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin continue to haggle over a package. The size of the plan and the language of the bill are the main sticking points. The Trump administration wants a $1.9 trillion package. Democrats want $2.4 trillion. And it's becoming a familiar story for Louisiana. Much of the state is under a hurricane warning. Zeta is headed towards the U.S. Gulf Coast after making landfall in Mexico. Zeta is the 27th named storm in what has been a very busy Atlantic season. If Zeta makes landfall in Louisiana, it will be the 5th named storm to hit the state this year. The U.S. is pushing for closer ties with India as that country faces a prolonged border conflict with China. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Defense Secretary Mark Esper met with top Indian officials in New Delhi today. Officials say they talked about ways to cooperate on pandemic response as well as changes in the Indo-Pacific region. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Stock of the Hour. We're taking a look at Caterpillar, and the shares of the big machinery company are down, even though the company did better than expected in the third quarter. Joining us now to explain all this is Abigail Doolittle. Abigail?
David, yeah, it is sort of an interesting reaction to have the stock down in one of the worst drags on the day for the Dow Industrials and even the S&P 500, even though they beat, and it was a big beat for adjusted earnings. However, although the company is cautiously optimistic, they're not providing a 2021 guidance or outlook. So investors really not liking that. And when we dig beneath the surface a little bit on the quarter, it helps to explain why they're not offering an outlook. And this has to do with the decline in machinery sales being down about 20% in September. So the growth, the demand, especially in energy and mining, still very tepid, weighing on this company. One bright spot, however, David, was China. They're saying that stimulus in that country is helping to boost demand. But overall, the company, the CEO, again, despite not being, being cautiously optimistic, they're not providing the outlook. And it reminds me of 2018 when they said this is as good as it gets. It turned out that that was correct. 2018 sales growth was the highest of the last few years, and this year expected to be down about 27%, David.
Well, staying with a similar sort of company, 3M, they had their earnings out as well. When you talk about China, 3M really does a lot of work in China. They're not doing so well either.
Another big drag, and that's one reason the industrials on the day are really the worst sector for the S&P 500, a real divergence for the S&P 500 in terms of the sectors that are doing well and those that are doing poorly. But yes, 3M, they, interestingly enough, they beat sales estimates because of strong demand for masks, respirators, other equipment that they're producing, especially that related to the pandemic. However, because of the expenses related to that demand, David, profits missed, so investors just not liking the sloppiness, if you will, of that quarter. So that stock is another one down, dragging on some of its competitors as well, again, explaining why the industrials are weak.
Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle. Coming up next, what are CEOs thinking about the election? We talk with Rich Lesser, who's the head of the Boston Consulting Group. And this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power. I'm Guy Johnson in London. European stocks wrapping up the day. Let's take a look at what kind of a trading session we've had. Negative yesterday, negative today. Two factors driving us really. Earnings and COVID, and certainly COVID has been the prime driver. Cases rising in Europe, hospitalizations rising in Europe, and now we're starting to see mortality picking up as well. The Stock 600 off session lows, but only just down by around 0.8%. We're down circa 2.5%, a little more over the last couple of days. In terms of the individual markets, actually you can see a read across from the COVID story. There is a growing expectation that France in particular will now see more restrictions in terms of what we're seeing around Europe. We're likely to see a move towards almost a complete lockdown. That is certainly what is now being talked about around the continent. The CAC 40 reflecting that risk today, down by 1.6%. But as you can see, selling really across the board. Yesterday it was Germany that really suffered with SAP. Today we don't have that single stock risk, but European equities broadly selling off. One sector in positive territory, Everything else is in negative territory. We're seeing a bit in the bond market. We're getting back down towards the bottom end of the range in terms of European yields, certainly for the majors like Germany. Negative 61, we'd be negative 62. We're getting back down to those kinds of levels. Interesting, though, we are seeing a bid on the euro. Remember, we've got the ECB Thursday. Brent crude also catching a bid, which is kind of counterintuitive, but we have seen some big selling earlier on yesterday. Let's talk about some of the single stock names that we have been watching. Reports over the last hour coming out of the Financial Times. The talks between LVMH and Tiffany are back on. There was always a suspicion that Bernard Arnault, who leads LVMH, was in for a different price, a better price. And maybe we're now starting to see confirmation of that. MC, LVMH trading down by around 0.5%. Big day for the banks today. HSBC, Europe's biggest listed bank, out with numbers and hints on the dividend, positive hints. That stock up by 3.4%. But if you take a look at the COVID effect, you could certainly find it in the property stocks. Unibail, Rodamco, Westfield. This is a mall operator. If we're going to see further restrictions, these are the kinds of places that people will not be going. Unibail trading down by 4.5%. That's a look at European markets. David.
Thank you so much, Guy. And over here on this side of the Atlantic, we're mildly off in equities as well, with the notable exception of the NASDAQ, which is up a bit more than 0.5%. Now let's turn back to the election. The two candidates for president this year have laid out some very different plans for the economy, which makes this election particularly important for American business. For a perspective on what the nation's CEOs are thinking, we welcome now someone who deals with them every day. He is Rich Lesser, CEO of the Boston Consulting Group. So, Rich, thank you so much for being with us. Give us a sense of what the CEOs are looking at. What is of concern to them? What do they hope? What do they fear?
So, well, first, it's a pleasure to be with you today. I think the first fear right now is the coming weeks. You know, unlike any election cycle I can remember, the risk of a contested election, of an election where many, many Americans question the legitimacy of the outcome, where we're really thrown into disarray in the weeks following the election, is a real risk. And I think that if your CEO is looking at that environment and what that will mean on everything from how well we control the pandemic to how well we roll out vaccines to how we get a next stimulus bill passed to the questions around the legitimacy of the government, which obviously has a flow through back to the economy, I think that's concern number one in the short term. And coming through this period with a clear outcome, whatever it is, I think is important to leaders around the country in the business community. Then when you go beyond that, obviously, as you said, there are different agendas that will come to the fore, and some of it will depend on the presidency, and some of it will depend on what happens in Congress as well. I think obviously, if there is a change in administrations, if Vice President Biden is elected, then he's got a very different agenda to pursue, and the business community will be focused a lot on how to help make sure that that agenda can be done in a way that can continue to sustain economic growth as well as a rebound from the pandemic in key sectors that have been so substantially affected.
Rich, as you know so well, typically at this stage in an election, we're looking at pocketbook issues. It's the economy, it's jobs, things like that. And I think President Trump definitely wanted to run on that subject, but COVID has sort of displaced almost everything in the minds of voters as we talk to people around the country. Is that true with CEOs as well? Is COVID-19 job one right now?
No, I think COVID-19 is job one. COVID-19, I mean, first of all, it's people's lives. I mean, the escalation in virus infection rates over the last few weeks, now approaching 70,000 people over the last 7 days, that translates into probably more than 1,000 deaths a day. And there's no sign that we're taking bold actions to get that under control in the short term. Of course, in the medium term, we're all hopeful that a vaccine will come along. So you have the obvious health risk to your customers, to your workers, and to the communities in which you live. I mean, that's job one. And then second is the flow through impact on the economy, which in the recent past has been managed well. The U.S. has done a good job with the response back in April and the stimulus that was passed, but we're losing the after effects of that and the extra income that we gave so many consumers around the country. We're losing that now as it gets wound down. And so there's also an economic element to sustain the momentum we've been able to create coming out of the challenges last spring.
Rich, as you talk to CEOs, how much do they need or want or expect from the federal government when it comes to dealing with this virus? Is it the federal government's job? Do they want more? Do they want more of a plan the way Vice President Biden talks about? Do they think President Trump has basically done what he can do and it's just the virus that's really doing it to us?
They want more than's been done already. I think that's a fairly safe. Of course, it's not a uniform group, but I think in general, if I think about the business roundtable that I'm a part of, and particularly on the COVID issues where we've done a ton of work, we need stronger response from the federal government. We need it in terms of encouraging mask wearing, which is one of the main things we can do to keep people safe, providing more guidelines to states around behaviors that will help protect the economy, but also protect people. We need it obviously in the next phase. I mean, on the work to date on getting a vaccine through, it's been unique in our history, the speed that it's been done. But the next stages are really hard as well. We need that to work well. We need better testing, tracking, and tracing. So I do think there's an important role, and I think the business community believes, for the federal government to try to bring down the rate of infection and get us through this very difficult fight phase until we can have a vaccine, when then we focus on accelerating the rollout.
Rich, as you say, and it really bears repeating, the CEOs are not a monolithic group. It's not homogeneous. Different people have different points of view. But overall, that concern to really get our hands around this, to really get control of it, does that extend so far as to say encouraging the federal government to take mandatory action as opposed to just issuing guidelines? I
think probably most CEOs would say mandatory may be a step too far for many things, particularly when in a disease where community by community, the impacts are so different. So the ability to say this community can stay open and that one should be imposing more restrictions, not necessarily even a lockdown, but more restrictions. I think that's a tough call to make for a country as big and diverse as the U.S. is, and in a virus that hits communities differently. I think where there is an expectation, though, is much sharper expectations and ideally some underlying foundations about how to test and track and trace more effectively so that you could do it across state borders, have it more consistent around the country. And of course, when it comes to the rollout of a vaccine, very sharp priorities around which segments of the population need it first, how we're going to make sure that we're managing to do it, particularly if we have to deal with cold chain issues for some of the vaccines or booster shots. These are exceptionally complex issues where the federal government could make an enormous difference versus 50 states and hundreds of local communities trying to figure it out on their own.
Rich, you and I have both mentioned now the stark difference in some of the policy positions of former Vice President Biden as opposed to President Trump right now on things like, let's be frank, tax, corporate and other tax, infrastructure spends, investment, borrowing, things like that. From your dealings with corporate CEOs, are they comfortable with the sort of direction Joe Biden would go if, in fact, he got elected? And of course, as you point out, what happens with the Senate may determine how far he can go.
I don't think CEOs are feeling a lot of comfort right now on any dimension. This is among the most uncomfortable years any of us can remember. The pandemic, the geopolitical challenges, the continued pressure on climate, the macroeconomic shock we had to come through, and now the uncertainties of whether we can keep the recent momentum going and rebuild sectors. So I don't think comfort is in the operating lingo for 2020. I do think when it comes to a Vice President Biden becoming president, there will be questions about how he shapes his administration, how much there's an emphasis on continuing to drive economic growth, how much policies, even policies that are broadly supported, like much bolder action on climate, are they done more by leveraging market forces? Or are they done more through, imposing very strict regulatory regimes that may not reflect the needs or the way to sustain growth in different sectors? So I think most leaders would view the results of this election as a change, but how to judge the change will largely depend on the choices that get made in the 3 to 5 months after the election occurs versus knowing how it will play out right now.
Rich, you advise some of the top companies, some of the top CEOs in the country about how to really structure their business, what to do. Give some advice to Vice President Biden if he gets elected right now. Would you advise him to have at least one former CEO or someone with some real business experience in there? Because it's been speculated that a lot of people on his staff don't have that experience. We remember in the early days of President Trump, he had all those groups of CEOs he'd summon to the White House and get together. Do you think that's important?
I spend my life talking to CEOs inside BCG and in so many communities about how diversity in leadership teams leads to better outcomes. I believe it so deeply, whether it's diversity in men and women, across ethnic lines, in many ways. And in this particular case, in answer to your question, I deeply believe if there were to be a President Biden, if he were to build a more diverse leadership team of different perspectives in trying to do that, the country will go further faster. I think that there are massive challenges to sustain economic growth and take on the massive issues we have, whether it's racial equity and justice, whether it's climate, whether it's getting past COVID and sustaining the economy. I think the business community has a lot to offer, not alone, but as a part of a team that the new president would build. I have no doubt it will be stronger. But I would say that pretty much to any leader, frankly, to look at how you build more diversity into your leadership and then make it really operate as a team. It's not enough to have diverse individuals. It's how do you bring it together, make them function as a team, listen and learn from each other, really have a spirit of what you're trying to achieve.
Really powerful point. Thank you so much, Rich. That was truly helpful. That's Rich Lesser. He's Boston Consulting Group CEO. Coming up, the Great Divide in Wisconsin. We talk with political scientist Catherine Kramer of the University of Wisconsin. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We continue our Swing State series, Look at Wisconsin, with a student of the state. Catherine Kramer, political science professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, has written a book about it. It's called The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin and the Rise of Scott Walker. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. We really are your students today. We want to learn as much as we can about Wisconsin, particularly politically as we go into this election. And I start with your book. Talk about the difference we've heard about between the rural part of the state and the urban/suburban.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on. So Wisconsin's a pretty rural state, and by that I mean there's roughly half of the population lives in what you could call a rural place and half in an urban place. And the divide that I wrote about, which many other states in the union are experiencing, is a perception among many people in rural places or smaller communities of feeling like they're not getting their fair share. They're not feeling like they're not getting their fair share of resources, of political power, of attention, of respect. And in 2016, that meant it was kind of fodder for President Trump's campaign, and he tapped into that sentiment pretty well. And many people are watching to see whether that's going to be the case again next week.
Well, I guess I have two questions there. Are the people who were committed to Donald Trump last time as committed this time? Are they as enthusiastic in the more rural areas? Number one. And number two, are the people who aren't committed to Donald Trump are more likely to show up to vote? Because I think last time one of the issues was voter turnout, wasn't it?
Yeah. All that's really spots of attention this time around. So people who supported Donald Trump last time around, I mean, many of his supporters are still very strongly behind him in Wisconsin. But I would say people who are a little bit more moderate or were a little bit more on the fence in 2016, it looks as though some of them are going for Biden. Part of what's going on here is a lot fewer people have yet to make up their minds. So this time, last time around in 2016, a week out, there were roughly 6%, according to polls, that hadn't made up their mind yet. And we see that number much lower this time around. And it looks like in early voting, which there's been a lot of in this state, that is trending towards the Democratic candidate. So it looks like there's still very strong support for Donald Trump. But the fact that Hillary Clinton is not his opponent this time around, I think, is important because she was pretty unpopular here, primarily in our rural communities and smaller communities. And Joe Biden seems to be a candidate that people don't have quite as visceral a reaction to. So looks like President Trump has a real challenge here in front of him in the state of Wisconsin.
You mentioned the absentee ballots, and we understand it looks like a record for Wisconsin, as is across the country. I mean, there are so many people, 65 million or something like that, who have voted already. We had overnight the ruling of the United States Supreme Court declining a request to essentially, as I understand it, extend the period of time when you would count those absentee ballots. Will that have a material difference, do you think, in the election?
It might. I mean, there are roughly, as I understand it, at least 300,000 requested ballots that are still outstanding. It could be more than that. And what it means is that people who don't get their ballot back to their city clerk's office by election day, or don't get it to their particular polling place by the close of polls on November 3rd, which is 8 o'clock Central Time, that ballot won't be counted. And that could be thousands of ballots. So it could make a big difference.
Professor, you've described the difference between the rural part of the state and the urban, suburban part of the state. Are the issues important to the voters different in those two camps, or is it they just come out differently on who would handle them better? What are the top issues? Is it COVID-19?
Yeah, great question. It's hard to tell in a way, because how people respond to that question of what's the most important issue is so strongly divided along partisan lines. So people who are leaning Republican say that it's the economy by far is the biggest important issue, but people who lean Democratic are saying it's the pandemic. So, and those, partisanship is very strongly correlated with geography in Wisconsin as elsewhere. So the rural parts of the state tend to lead Republican. So it's a little bit harder to tell. And again, depending on how you lean in terms of partisanship, that affects who you think is best able to handle both of those issues. So Democrats say Biden is much better on the economy and the pandemic, and Republicans are saying President Trump is the one for them.
I don't want to tempt fate here, but what about the possibility of some resistance or social unrest surrounding the polling places? We've heard rumors about people monitoring the polling places and things like that. There has been a history, most recently in Kenosha, of some unrest. Are you concerned about that in Wisconsin?
Sure. A little bit, honestly. I mean, Wisconsin was known as a very kind of civil, nice state until relatively recently, but we're very divided along partisan lines here. I mean, it's a purple state, meaning there's strong opinions on both sides and roughly equal numbers of people on both sides. But also, mentioning Kenosha, I mean, racial justice and racial resentment, racial unrest is front and center in Wisconsin in a way I don't think it ever has been, or at least not in the last 20 years. And so, in Kenosha, we had a shooting of an unarmed black man by a white police officer, followed by the shooting of 3 protesters by a young white man, and 2 of whom died. And so, how that will impact Election Day, no one really knows so far. Most of the talk is rumors. But I have to say that the fact that there was, a kidnapping plan for Governor Whitmer just next door to us in Michigan has people really a bit on edge about what the possibilities really are.
Yeah, it's a different Midwest from the one I thought I knew. Thank you so much. Really a delight having you with us, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
That's Professor Catherine Kramer of the University of Wisconsin. And be sure to check out our special on the swing states. That's airing Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will be available online as well. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. With Amy Coney Barrett now seated as a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States, Democrats are weighing their options to reform the High Court, should they win control of the White House and the Senate. Besides controversial court packing, there are some other alternatives as well. Bloomberg Law's Siri Belushu and Harvard professor Noah Feldman take a look at some of them.
One idea is term limits for justices. There's just one problem. That line from the Constitution, the one that says judges shall hold their office during good behavior, it doesn't say it directly, but good behavior has always been interpreted to mean that judges would serve for life, unless they were impeached. The idea was that a justice should be independent and insulated from political pressure. The problem is that it's made Supreme Court nominations rare, and now they're highly politically charged. One proposal gaining traction is to create 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices, staggered so a new justice is confirmed every 2 years. Proponents say this could work by giving the retiring justice senior status and rotating them to a lower court. In fact, 3 members of Congress have introduced legislation that would do just that. But Noah Feldman has his doubts.
To my mind, that represents a very problematic and doubtful reading of the Constitution and of its intent. It doesn't seem to be consistent with our tradition of how we've come to understand Supreme Court tenure.
Ultimately, the best approach might just be the old-fashioned one. Wait until a seat opens up.
It's very hard to use ordinary statutory reforms to change an institution that has its roots in the Constitution. If you ask me, is there a mechanism of reform that stands out as simple and easy and that wouldn't break the institutional capacity of the court? I don't see one at the moment.
That was Noah Feldman of Harvard University and Bloomberg Law's Siri Belushu talking about possible reforms to the Supreme Court. By the way, it was tried back in the 80s when President Reagan was president, and they didn't get anywhere with curtailing jurisdiction. Coming up here, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk with SBA Administrator Jovita Carranza. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.